This video looks at George in chapter 1 of Mice and Men. Now, it's probably traditional to see George as a good character, fundamentally a decent human being, coping with the stresses of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, with the injustice and violence this brings about in wider society. But a deeper analysis would also consider how far he is also violent and compromised by the society around him, so that his actions also can be seen as immoral. And it is this tension between the moral purpose of George and his immoral actions that will lead you to get the highest grades. Steinbeck introduces George and Lennie with some strange military allusions. So they begin, even in the open, one stayed behind the other. This idea of them in single file is a very military image. But look at this, even in the open, as though they're soldiers not just in training, but actually in combat. In combat, you'd line up in the open, if you had to travel across the open, one behind the other, to make it much more difficult for you to be shot. So immediately, George is associated with the world of violence and controlled aggression. This military symbolism, or martial symbolism, is further emphasised by the fact that both are dressed in the same way, with denim trousers, denim coats, which begins to look like a uniform and is then like a military uniform having brass buttons. The alliteration here at the end of the sentence on brass buttons emphasises their military appearance, again suggesting the violence that surrounds them. They also appear to be men of action. Their blanket rolls are rolled tight, as though they are disciplined and ready for instant movement. Again, they're associated not just with violence but with death. So their hats are black, symbolic of death, and they both wear them. Again, typical of a military uniform, each man dressed like the other. Next, we meet George as an individual. He is the first man, a man who is possibly used to doing well. Outside of the Great Depression, he might well have been a success. And he is small and quick, a suggestion that he makes up for his small stature with intelligence, and also then this sinister aspect. He is dark of face, as though capable of evil or disguise. So our first meeting with George is not that of a moral individual. He appears on first meeting, for example, completely unlike Slim. The description continues with a sinister aspect. So he has restless eyes as though searching for victims, and this is emphasised again by the fact that his features are sharp, suggesting that he's dangerous, and again that strength also suggests that he's dangerous. And then we have this sibilance, the repetition of the S's in restless eyes, sharp, strong features. Sibilance typically reminiscent of that hissing sound that we associate with evil. My videos on symbolism will also show that the setting here in chapter 1 is also very Eden-like, and the role of the snake then here appears to be played by George. He is the one who is going to tempt both himself and Lennie towards evil. At least that's one possible interpretation. Next, we have the introduction of some contradiction. So every part of him was defined. He appears incredibly real. He is strong, a powerful figure. But then set against this in red, I've underlined the features that make him seem weak, small, slender, thin, and bony. So one of the interpretation of this could be to show how he has been reduced by his economic circumstances. Not literally, he hasn't become small because he is poor, although he may well have become thin and bony because of his poverty. And then the final thing that we notice about George in this description is that Steinbeck has deliberately created him to be the opposite of Lennie. And if we take this a little bit further, Lennie is a completely innocent character who doesn't understand evil and nevertheless commits evil acts, whereas George is a highly intelligent character who fully appreciates what is evil, but commits an evil act in killing Lennie in order to save him. And this is the inherent contradiction inside George, that pull between moral behaviour and immoral behaviour for an apparently good purpose. Again, if we consider, as I will in other videos and have done, the religious symbolism of the book, then George becomes an anti-religious figure in many ways, or at least an anti-Christian one. So one way of reading this is him saying to Lennie, "God, you're a lot of trouble," to Lennie. But a more subtle reading will also notice that "you're a lot of trouble, God." In other words, the subliminal message here is an attack on God. In this reading, God provides their fate, the fate that the title of the novel, Of Mice and Men, is directed at. Their plans gang off to Gley because fate intervenes. No matter how well they plan for success, fate or God steps in and stops it happening, at least here, potentially from George's perspective. The other thing we might notice about George is his dislike of being with Lennie. "I could get along so easy without you. I could live so easy." So in chapter 1, Steinbeck already sets up a motive for George getting rid of Lennie. This, of course, would be a deeply cynical reading of why he kills Lennie, but it's nevertheless one we should keep in mind, because he does literally get away with murder at the end of the book. And a final thing you'll notice in this description is this curious ending, "and maybe have a girl." So even in the best case scenario that he can imagine, having a girlfriend is not certain. This suggests that George has some deep problem communicating with women, at least where love or sex might be involved. And perhaps this is because he's deeply sexist, as we shall see when he meets Curly's wife. George is also described rather like an actor. So when he tells Lennie about their dream ranch, he repeated his words rhythmically, just like an actor would, as though he had said them many times before, like an actor rehearsing a script. On the one hand, this helps us to view the vision of this dream ranch as an exercise in make-believe, to keep Lennie happy. But it's also an exercise in deception. And there is a sense, perhaps, that George is not what he seems. Perhaps symbolically, Steinbeck uses this description of George's voice becoming deeper to ask us to think more deeply about George and his motives. Steinbeck uses George to introduce perhaps the main theme of the novel when he describes the life of the migrant worker as the loneliest guys in the world. And we can certainly see that in chapter 1, Steinbeck wants us to sympathise with both men, but particularly with George, who can only seem to escape loneliness through his choice of companion in the very inadequate Lennie. George is obsessed with companionship and escaping loneliness, and this is why he contrasts his relationship with Lennie to that of other migrant workers and ranch hands. They, and you get the idea. Completely unlike George and Lennie, And that's picked up here in red. With us. George went on, with us it ain't like that. We got a future. We got friends. And in this repetition, we can see a kind of desperation to avoid loneliness and seek out companionship. But you will notice when we get to the final chapter that once Lennie is being killed, George is then free to choose a next companion, and it's perhaps significant that he walks off with Slim. Steinbeck lays the ground for this by making sure that we see George's easy anger in this scene. So he jerks down his hat, he scowls at Lennie, he's easily moved to anger. And once again, he uses blasphemy, taking the Lord's name in vain, if you like, and being anti-Christian. Jesus Christ, you're a crazy bastard. And the expletive here is typical of the unsympathetic way he talks to Lennie. And again, we can look at a more subliminal reading of the line. You're a crazy bastard is directed at this person, Jesus Christ. Again, an anti-religious view. This will become important because the Easter story, if you like, the story of Jesus' crucifixion and then ascension into heaven, is reversed in this novel. So whereas Jesus is crucified on the Friday and then resurrected on the Sunday, in the novel this is reversed. They arrive at this Eden-like state and then the ranch on a Friday, and Lennie is killed on the Sunday, not to be resurrected at all. So the Christian story is deliberately inverted, turned on its head. And with George, this even happens at sentence level, turning this idea of Christianity on its head within the sentence. We are also given unpleasant insights into the rest of George's character. So he is, with Lennie, like an emperor, imperiously. He seems to relish his power over the other larger man, and that man, Lennie, becomes less than a man. In the simile here is described as like a terrier, and the importance of that is it shows how much George enjoys his command over Lennie, and perhaps how damaging it is to Lennie, even though, and this is where the contradiction is, it's for Lennie's own good. George's role here is to be the master of the subservient dog. And this imagery certainly calls into question George's motives. Does he really need to be quite so harsh? Does he really need to have such control? And the next description is possibly designed by Steinbeck to make us actively dislike George. George snapped his fingers sharply. Again, the sibilance here of snapped fingers sharply suggests how sinister and perhaps evil George is being toward Lennie. And so our sympathies start to move away from him. Next, George's anger erupts. George exploded over an incredibly trivial request from Lennie for ketchup. Look at what happens to the language here. This is the we of companionship that George seemed so keen on just a few pages before, but look at what that becomes. I. Complete self-interest, completely overcoming his desire for companionship with Lennie. And once again that calls into question just how far George wants Lennie's companionship. Most interpret this as a moment of frustration for George, of constantly having to look after Lennie and constantly losing his job because of what Lennie does. In other words, we sympathise with him. But underneath that, his anger also reveals his true self. And his true self here, perhaps, is one that wants to be without Lennie. And at the end of the novel, his dream comes true. Again, that's a cynical way of looking at George's relationship, but the language analysis here also suggests that it's It's a way of reading that you could justify if you wanted to. And then George expresses very neatly his motive for getting away from Lennie. When I think of the swell time I could have without you, I go nuts. And this addition here of I go nuts shows how desperate he is to get rid of Lennie. On the other hand, of course, we can use this to sympathise even more with George, because despite the fact that he's so desperate to get away from Lennie, he redoubles his efforts to keep Lennie safe and with him. In other words, he sacrifices his own happiness for Lennie's. And then Steinbeck seems to change the mood again, with George apparently feeling guilt. "I've been mean, ain't I?" He says, apparently regretting it to Lennie, so that we come to sympathise more with George and see him as more self-aware. The chapter then deliberately ends with humour, so that we are left with a better image of George. So there is a joke shared with the reader here when Lennie asks for different colour rabbits, and George replies, "Sure we will, red and blue and green rabbits, millions of them." But if we wanted to take an alternative interpretation, we might think that Lennie could take this at face value. He might actually expect these different coloured kinds of rabbits. In other words, George is practising another kind of deceit on Lennie, knowing that Lennie will eventually be disappointed when these colour rabbits cannot appear. Similarly, the last lines he speaks to Lennie can be read humorously. "You can just as well go to hell, shut up now." But if we look at the language in more detail, we can see a different interpretation offers itself. "You can just as well go to hell," again picking up that anti-Christian feel. George condemning Lennie to hell. And a strictly Christian reading of the novel would say that's exactly what happens. Lennie murders Curly's wife, has committed a mortal sin, and then George kills him. Lennie's soul will therefore go to hell if we take a Christian view of the novel. And we can read this "shut up now" as final impatience with Lennie. George has had enough and now wants to get rid of him. Yes, these are the words of a tired man, and we don't have to see anything sinister in them, but alternatively we can, if we choose, decide to see him as finally deciding he's had enough of Lennie and wants to get rid of him once and for all. So there you have it. Steinbeck deliberately presents George as a deeply complex character, one full of Christian symbolism because he becomes a kind of anti-Christian figure, and one whose actions we are unsure how to interpret. Is he basically a good person struggling to get by in difficult circumstances, or has he become evil in nature and exploiting his relationship with the more innocent Lennie? In Chapter 1, Steinbeck presents George as a conflicted figure, struggling with his moral responsibility towards Lennie and his desire to escape Lennie's influence. In Chapter 2, Steinbeck uses George to explore the effects of society, and a depressed society, an economically poor society, on an otherwise good man, which George represents. Steinbeck has some fun here with George in deciding to call him George Milton. This is a heavy clue leading us towards the famous British poet Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. And in Paradise Lost, Milton charts the war between Lucifer, now known as Satan, but at that stage an angel, God's right-hand angel if you like, and Lucifer rebelled against God. There was a battle amongst the angels, and Lucifer was condemned to hell as a result. And through this, Steinbeck is asking the question, will George be condemned to hell? when he kills Lennie. And if you flash forward to the last words of the novel now, you will see just how powerfully Steinbeck brings this idea forward with, now what the hell do you suppose is eating those guys? Or jump to my video on chapter 6. So the name Milton is chosen very clearly in order to point out that George is constructed by Steinbeck to explore the differences between good and evil, moral and immoral. The next thing we notice about George is that he is scared of other men. Not scared of them physically, but scared of them gaining some kind of power over him through information. He doesn't trust other people. And Steinbeck is suggesting that this is a product of the incredible poverty from the Great Depression, where instead of men turning to aid each other, they simply look after themselves and stop trusting other people, no matter how well-intentioned they are. It's only when Candy shows some subservience, guy on a ranch don't never listen nor he don't ask no questions, to George, that he decides to accept him. And we see that it's important for George to be higher up in the hierarchy. And that perhaps explains part of his attraction to partnering Lennie. He's always superior to Lennie and is always Lennie's master. Steinbeck uses George now to foreshadow the later events of the novel, in particular here, the fight between Lennie and Curly. Lennie ain't no fighter, but Lennie's strong and quick, and Lennie don't know no rules. But we can look deeper at this. What's George actually saying about Lennie? He's saying that Lennie is impossible to control. Lennie don't know no rules. He's actually dangerous. This makes it all the more curious that when we get to the fight, George has an opportunity to stop it, and indeed Slim tries to stop it, but George won't let him. In other words, George knows how dangerous Lennie is, but encourages him to be dangerous anyway. And this makes us look a little harder at George's responsibility in using Lennie as an uncontrolled weapon in this way. Steinbeck is also keen to portray George as both sensitive and intelligent. We see here that he confesses that he's scared. We can't imagine George confessing that to anyone else. He does this to his companion because he puts an absolute trust in Lennie, because Lennie can't look down on him for it. Lennie will understand that fear, because Lennie also feels afraid. His astuteness and insight into other characters is revealed here in his assessment of Curly. He's got you scared and he's going to take a sock at you the first chance he gets. George is part of a casually violent world where men display their place in the hierarchy through violence. Some readers see George's attraction to Lennie partly as having such a strong figure as an ally, but other readers look at this fear here and see Lennie as a liability. And Lennie's strength therefore offers little protection. It's actually far more likely to lead to trouble. Despite George's fear, however, it's his hatred that gets the better of him. I hate that kind of bastard. And so here, Steinbeck is asking us to question George. Is he just a violent personality who naturally dislikes people, or has he been made this way by the Great Depression? Because this is also a political novella. Steinbeck is trying to make the point that poverty corrupts people. It makes them less moral. And therefore it is our moral duty to end poverty. Steinbeck draws out the cruel side of George's character through his instant assessment of Curly's wife. Now, to a teenage reader, this might not seem too remarkable. my daughter's at university, and even now she still judges people instantly based on their appearance and just a few seconds experience of them. It's something that comes naturally to the young. And this is something that should change with age. But with George it hasn't. He is incredibly judgmental from the moment he's seen Curly's wife. And his judgment is that she's obviously promiscuous, sleeping around. He has no evidence for this other than the fact that she was flirting with him and Lennie. And then he supposes that for $20 he would be able to buy her, not necessarily as a possession, but to persuade her to leave her husband and follow him. In other words, he reduces her entirely to a sexual object, and indeed one that can be purchased. In this way, to him, all women appear to be prostitutes, with the exception of Lennie's Aunt Clara, and perhaps it is easier to think of Lennie's Aunt Clara in a positive light because she's dead. So there's a negative and unforgiving side to George's character that Steinbeck is keen to draw out in the second chapter. Because we sympathise with George more than many of the other characters in the novel, Steinbeck presents his sexism in the hope, perhaps, that readers will see their own sexism reflected in his behaviour and use George as a way to question their own sexist beliefs. And Steinbeck will keep doing this with George. He'll make us feel sorry for him and identify with him, and then George will do something that we question and maybe won't accept. And in this way, he's constantly toying with our own prejudices. And when I say our own, he's obviously writing for an audience in the 1930s in America who would have shared many of George's prejudices which today, as a 21st century audience, we might not share. Indeed, she has been in the bunkhouse for under a minute. It probably only takes you a minute to read that single page on which she appears talking to George and Lennie. But look at the violence of his language. He calls Lennie a crazy bastard. He speaks fiercely. He says she's a bitch, that bitch. He calls her poison. He calls her a piece of jailbait. We would call this language vitriolic. It's intense and accusing. And there's a clear sense that George has gone too far. And why is she a bitch? Well, it seems to be because she has aroused sexual desire in him. And she's poison because she's trying to make herself attractive to men. And the reason that that's poison is if he becomes attracted to her, there is likely to be violence between him and Curly, and one of them, committing violence to the other, is likely to go to jail. Now, what's interesting here is the blame for all of that is attached squarely on the woman. But in order for it to result in any kind of jailbait, it depends on the men reacting extremely violently. George doesn't criticise that, he just sees that as the natural order of things. Of course they're going to react violently. Of course someone is going to physically damage or kill their rival. And so here, Steinbeck uses George to show how poisonous male society is. Perhaps he is saying that in a richer economy, men wouldn't fight so hard to defend what little they have. It's only because they have so little that they're willing to fight so viciously about small things. And finally, Steinbeck uses George's relationship with Curly's wife here, or indeed his lack of relationship, as a way of foreshadowing the violence that will follow when Lennie is left alone with her and then kills her. When that happens, he and Candy will both blame her for her own death. despite the fact that it's actually Lennie's violence that is responsible. And so by the end of chapter 2, we have probably lost a good deal of sympathy for George. We have seen him be unfair to Lennie, and now he is even more unfair to Curly's wife. George in chapter 3 serves at least two purposes. We've seen him so far in conjunction with Lennie. They've been a pair, a steadfast and inseparable pair, but in chapter 3 we now see George branch out on his own in his relationship with Slim. And the more cynical among you might see this as laying the groundwork for the departure in chapter 6, which doesn't just end with the shooting of Lennie, it ends with George going off with Slim in a new partnership. And the second purpose of this chapter is as a confessional. Slim takes on the aspect of God. He becomes symbolic as God's representative. Not that Steinbeck is suggesting he's in any way Christian, he's inverting the Christian story. So someone who may not have any Christian belief at all, we simply don't know, comes to take the place of God, and or a priest here, and George confesses his sins to him. As if to emphasise Slim's ungodliness, he moved his back slightly so the light was not on his face. This is an image of disguise, an image of dishonesty, and it's not the typical interpretation of Slim. Most people see him as an upright character. Funny how you and him string along together. It was Slim's calm invitation to confidence. George, as usual, is defensive, but is immediately drawn into Slim's manner. We see George as modest. I ain't so bright neither, or I wouldn't be bucking barley for my 50 and found. In other words, if he was intelligent, he wouldn't have been reduced to this kind of poverty. And this also suggests that poverty has made him less intelligent. After all, he doesn't have to spend his money on whiskey and the cat house, as he calls it. He could be saving it. And Lennie's tastes are even more simple. They could be saving Lennie's money also, but they haven't done. George acknowledges this. If I was bright, if I was even a little bit smart, I'd have my own little place, and I'd be bringing in my own crops. George fell silent. He wanted to talk. Here, Steinbeck is exploring one of his other themes of the novel, the desire for companionship and to avoid loneliness. And again, we can see George supplanting his relationship with Lennie and replacing it with Slim. We could take the religious symbolism a little further here. So when Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden for breaking God's commandment not to eat from the tree, from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, their punishment is to till the soil, which will be reluctant to bring forth crops. And here we have a parody of that. The crops are produced, but they're not for George and they're not for Lennie, they're for other people. So this is the height of reluctance for the land to produce crops for him. The religious Christian theme is picked up further, and so we see the godlike eyes of Slim, but they are seen through George's perspective almost. So he sees Slim as godlike and therefore gives his confession to him. I used to have a hell of a lot of fun with him, used to play jokes on him because he was too dumb to take care of himself, was too dumb even to know he had a joke played on him. And now George is going to confess the cruel things that he's done to Lennie in the past, lessons that he's learnt and have made him a better person, at least to Lennie. Again, Steinbeck suggests that George is playing something out that's much larger than himself. He's dealing with Christian morality here, contrasting it with hell and God. This is the dichotomy that's within everyone, a conflict between good and evil. And through the relationship between George and Lennie, Steinbeck is asking whether innocence and goodness is ever truly possible. We will see this through Lennie, who doesn't understand evil and yet commits the most evil act in murdering Curly's wife, and George, who fully understands evil but sacrifices his chance of heaven, if you like, by killing Lennie in order to preserve Lennie's dignity in death. And so Steinbeck really labours this kind of Christian imagery. He'd do any damn thing I told him, again foreshadowing the possible damnation of his own soul when he kills Lennie, and obviously Lennie's soul when he kills Curly's wife. Now, you're perfectly within your rights to say no, that there is no religious symbolism there. Steinbeck is simply using the language of the time. But then I would counter with the repetition here. That wasn't so damn much fun after a while. And I'm going to argue that Steinbeck's doing this deliberately. You don't have to accept that, of course, but a discussion of this will always be A-star territory for you, no matter which way you decide the symbolism works. And then he picks it up again here. I've beat the hell out of him, and he could have bust every bone in my body just with his hands, but he never lifted a finger against me. Here Steinbeck uses George to symbolise man's need to dominate. Now, it's traditional to look at this violence in man's nature here as being nurtured by poverty. You know, in times of economic success, people are much more likely to be kinder towards each other because they don't have to fight for economic gain. But this has happened some time before, and perhaps before the Depression, we don't know. If it is before the Depression, it's suggesting that this is simply human nature and not the result of economic circumstance and poverty at all. And now George's voice was taking on the tone of confession. So Steinbeck is being really clear about the Christian symbolism he's developing here and the relationship between George and Slim. And this is given added emphasis by the choice of the river that Steinbeck chooses George to get Lennie to jump into. It has the word sacrament in it. A bargain between the believer and their God. This is deeply ironic because instead of this being a bargain of good Christian behaviour, it's the river that George tells Lennie to jump into, even though Lennie can't swim. On the other hand, Steinbeck might be using George to say that his Christian belief is appropriate because it's this moment when he nearly kills Lennie that made me stop that. In other words, this is like a bargain with God, in which he's now decided to pursue moral behaviour. If we take this reading, he doesn't use George to suggest that man is irredeemably evil. He does the opposite. He uses George to suggest that man is capable of great goodness, and in that way can be saved. Next, the Steinbeck starts to sow the seeds of George abandoning Lennie. So from being a person who we associate with goodness, he has a more sinister aspect here. So he stacked the scattered cards and began to lay out his solitaire hand. This is a recurring symbol, or motif if you like, solitaire reminding us of solitariness, being alone, and this is what George is contemplating. If we're being more charitable, we see that as what he is trying to escape with his relationship with Lennie. But if we're more cynical, he's trying to escape the loneliness he still feels with Lennie by allying himself with Slim. I ain't got no people, George said, and what he means is he doesn't have a family, but because he doesn't say family and he says people, he's suggesting that, subconsciously at any rate, that he doesn't see Lennie as a real person. Lennie therefore becomes lesser than a person and perhaps expendable. He sees how other men get wanting to fight all the time, and although he professes to want to avoid fighting, immediately he says that he hates Curly. He hates that kind of guy, and when the opportunity arises for him to stop the fight with Lennie and Curly, he doesn't. He encourages Lennie to finish Curly off. And in the tone of the confessional now, George confesses his motive for wanting to get rid of Lennie. Of course, Lennie is a goddamn nuisance most of the time, said George, but you get used to going round with a guy and you can't get rid of him. And notice the choice of words here. He doesn't say you can't leave him behind, you can't escape him. He's very clear. You can't get rid of him. Very sinister foreshadowing here, because that's exactly what George does. Now, what I'm giving you here is not the typical interpretation of the novel. The typical interpretation is that George is a noble character here who sacrifices his own well-being in order to kill Lennie in the most humane manner possible. But I'm suggesting that he also has a motive that will make it easier for him to kill Lennie. He knows that he'll be far better off without him. George's attitude to Curly's wife is really interesting. One view is to see him as deeply sexist. He says of her, she's going to make a bad mess. There's going to be a bad mess. She's jailbait, all set on the trigger. This is real vitriol attacking her. This is no place for a girl, especially like her. He really detests her, which seems entirely unreasonable. He's only just met her. He appears to see women's sexuality as dangerous and threatening. And Steinbeck could be using George to show how cruel sexism is in society, so that women have no hope of being judged as human beings before they are first judged as sex objects. Other readers take a different view. Steinbeck, instead of simply making George sexist, is making him prescient, giving him some foresight of the future and foreshadowing what actually happens. She does seem to make a mess. It is a bad mess because it results in Lennie killing her, and then it results in George killing Lennie. And this is referenced here, all set on the trigger. He means the bait is set on the trigger of a trap, but this word trigger we automatically also associate with a gun, and it's the gun that George is going to use to kill Lennie. But you could still pursue the idea of sexism in that none of this is Curly's wife's fault. It's not her fault that Lennie kills her. She doesn't create the bad mess, Lennie does. And in fact, if we look even deeper, the bad mess is actually caused by George. Lennie breaks Curly's wife's neck because he's trying to shut her up. Why? Because George says he's not allowed to talk to Curly's wife. And so it's George's prohibition that has caused the fear in Lennie that has caused him to kill Curly's wife. So, in this reading, George's sexism and attack against Curly's wife, his verbal attack and his prejudice against her, has actually directly caused Lennie to silence her and therefore directly caused him to kill her. So if we wanted to take the most cynical view, George's sexism is responsible for the death of Curly's wife. And Steinbeck could be using this to symbolise how all women are, if you like, denied a full life by the sexism of male society. So if you want to portray Steinbeck as a feminist, then you will use George substantially to prove this point. If you don't, then you'll emphasise his role in foreshadowing the eventual tragedy of Lennie's death and, of course, Curly's wife's. When George takes Candy up on his offer to help buy the little farm, it's described almost as a religious experience. George said reverently, "Jesus Christ," and his eyes were full of wonder. It feels like a religious experience. This is the very kind of language that Steinbeck would use if he was to describe, or if he were to describe, a religious experience. In this way, the little ranch, the little farm that they're going to buy, becomes associated in George's mind with heaven. One way of looking at this is thinking of it as simply a fantasy. That's if you take the atheistic view, but you could portray here George as a Christian. So this becomes, instead of an expletive, a kind of prayer, and that's backed up by this, a kind of realization that the world can be a better place. There is a God, if you like. Fate does not have tragedy at the end of it. It can have wonder, the promise of heaven. This will be important because when George kills Lennie, he makes sure that Lennie has that vision of the farm in his head, fixed. And in this reading, George is giving him a vision of heaven, as though he's trying to save Lennie's soul. The irony, of course, is that he can't, because if this is a Christian universe that George and Lennie are inhabiting, then Lennie's going to go to hell because he's committed murder, whether he meant to or not. No sooner has George imagined that this dream ranch will actually come true than he sets about destroying it. Now, this is probably at an unconscious level. He doesn't know this is what he's doing. But as soon as Lennie gets into a fight, he begs for George to stop it. And he doesn't. Instead, he gets Lennie, "Get him, Lennie, don't let him do it," to attack Curly. He knows that Lennie is very likely to damage Curly very severely, if not disable him. That's precisely what he warned Candy about at the beginning of the book. This can only lead to them being sacked with no money, and suddenly the dream dies. They'll never be able to afford the little place, the farm. Steinbeck makes sure that Lennie gives George another chance. Make him stop, George! George could intervene. He could sacrifice himself here, standing between Curly and Lennie. He could let Curly hit him. You know, how important is this dream ranch to him? And the answer here, I think, is that his love of Lennie is trumped, is beaten by his hatred for Curly. And Curly is a man he's only just met, and yet this hatred overpowers his love of giving Lennie what he wants, and also giving himself what he wants. So through George here, Steinbeck is suggesting that man is ultimately self-destructive. And perhaps Steinbeck is making a wider point about mankind here. Lennie represents man's true innocence, if you like. He doesn't know the difference between right and wrong, good and evil. As we can see when he just says, "Oh, I done another bad thing." He doesn't really understand it. Killing a mouse or holding a dead mouse in his pocket is just as bad as killing Curly's wife to him. He has no knowledge of good and evil. And that brings us back to the original state that Adam and Eve were in the Bible, in Genesis. They simply didn't understand what good and evil meant. Yet, Steinbeck is going to use Lennie to kill Curly's wife because he's suggesting that there is no true state of innocence. We are basically just violent beings. And George epitomizes this. Even though he's highly intelligent and rational, his subconscious, if you like, allows him to throw all his dreams away, to destroy the love he has for this vision of future prosperity, the love he has for Lennie, destroy it all in one moment. Because men are addicted to tragedy. If we look at this interpretation of the novel, the quotation from the poem, "The best laid plans of mice and men gang off to Gley," isn't some complaint about fate, an uncaring universe driving mankind towards tragedy and failure. It's worse than that. It's our own very natures. And this leaves us with two possible interpretations. Steinbeck uses George to show that mankind is truly evil, or Steinbeck is looking at Lennie and George to show that we are created in God's image. That's what Genesis says. And God is also addicted to violence and cruelty. And in this version, there can be no happy ending. The dream of heaven is just that, a dream, just like the dream of the ranch. Steinbeck emphasises that point when he has Slim try to intervene. "I'll get him myself." He wants to stop the fight and is willing to sacrifice himself to stop Curly attacking a defenceless Lennie. But George refuses, in fact quite violently. He put out his hand and grabbed Slim and prevents him from saving the dream. It's at this moment that Steinbeck lets us know that George is responsible for the lack of hope here, and he is ultimately responsible for the tragedy which unfolds. Once Lennie has crushed Curly's hand, the first word George says to Slim is, "Slim, will we get canned now?" This is when the tragedy of his situation becomes real, or at least that's one way of looking at it. But if we look at George's unconscious mind here, this is also a request. Unconsciously, he doesn't want this dream to come true. And this vision of perfection that he'll have in the little place is something he rejects. And if we want to take that further towards Christian symbolism, he's asking about the original state of Eden. Given the chance to go back to Eden, would we do exactly the same as Adam and Eve and destroy it in order to get banished from it? To George, it seems, having the dream is much more important than realising it. And perhaps Steinbeck is arguing that that's the same with life. We'd much rather dream of a future heaven than work hard to create it here on earth. And so we're left with two possibilities. One, the Great Depression and poverty has reduced mankind to this lowest level. Or two, the Great Depression and poverty has simply distilled what we are truly like as people and revealed it. George goes missing in chapter 4. This is for a number of reasons. Steinbeck wants to explore other themes, particularly the prejudice of racism and sexism. He wants to explore the theme of isolation, and therefore it's necessary to leave Lennie on his own. But I think he also wants us to question George's motives. So where's George been? He's been to the brothel. Here's a picture of a New Orleans brothel in 1936 and 37. It's the kind of place that we can imagine George visiting, not for sex, but to sit down and have a whiskey. But to do that is going to cost him money. It's going to take money out of his investment, that investment in the Dream Ranch. And that was an investment that he'd thought about only a couple of hours, maybe 3 or 4 hours at most, before. That's literally how long it was since Candy decided he could put up his $350. Consequently, every cent that they earn is vital in securing the deposit on the farm. Yet, possibly within minutes of that decision, George has decided to go out to the brothel. And of course there is a further possibility that he's decided to have sex there and spend a lot more of their money. Steinbeck refuses to tell us which. And this is another way in which men are portrayed as perhaps worse than women. The title from the Daily Mail here is Life in Hard Times, and there's a sense that women would turn to prostitution because there wasn't another way to earn a living. For George, there is a choice here. He does not have a good enough reason to go out and start spending this money, especially as he is also in hard times. And yet he is already prepared to endanger his future and Lennie's by visiting the brothel. Steinbeck also wants us to question the companionship between the two men. And if George has deliberately left Lennie here, this is foreshadowing the way that he's going to leave Lennie in chapter 6 by shooting him. And once again, Steinbeck is suggesting that maybe at the back of his mind, this idea of being without Lennie is becoming more and more real and not just a fantasy. When George returns to find Lennie in Crooks's room, he looks disapprovingly about. And this is a signal that George is racist. He doesn't think Lennie should be associating with the black man, Crooks. His disgust is also revealed here. George stood framed in the door. He doesn't even want to enter the room himself, and he's framed there. Steinbeck, using the word framed, is deliberately creating a picture, because it is a picture that is framed, and this is a picture of racism. It's not the vindictive racism that Curly's wife exhibits when she threatens to have Crooks killed, but it's just as powerful because it is permanent. Just like a picture is once it's framed, it's there on display. And then his syntax reveals how distressed he is to find Lennie there. Instead of saying, "You shouldn't be in here," he's got this strange convoluted syntax, "You hadn't ought to be in here," as though he's actually confused by Lennie's lack of racism. He simply assumed that Lennie would be just as racist as everybody else. The reason Lennie isn't racist is, as Crooks observes, Lennie's a nice fella, because Lennie is as close to innocent as it is possible for a person to be, and this is done deliberately by Steinbeck to contrast with George, because he's suggesting that George is not a nice fella. George is equally angry at Candy for talking about the Dream Ranch. "I thought I told you not to tell anybody about that." If you remember, George was worried that this would mean they'd get sacked as soon as the bosses found out they were actually trying for a better life. Out of spite, he imagined, they would ruin that opportunity and sack them so they could never save enough money. This is deeply ironic because the only person who's costing them money is George. He's the one who's just been out spending it. Steinbeck then uses Candy with George to expose their casual racism. Candy says he didn't tell nobody but Crooks, as though Crooks doesn't count. He's a non-entity, has no power in the world. And George, instead of saying, "Right, let's go back to the bunkhouse," says, "You guys get out of here," showing just how horrible it is for him to contemplate their presence with a black man. And then we have this self-deception of George. "Jesus, seems like I can't go away for a minute." Well, he's been away a lot longer than that. And also he's left Lennie, who he knows is dangerous, exposed. He's not being watched, he's not being looked after. Now, certainly we can sympathise with George for wanting some time away from Lennie, but the other person who's left on the ranch is Curly's wife, who George has already identified as a danger. And then there's another thing to consider. Curly has also gone into town to sleep with prostitutes. And George, who hates Curly and knows there's going to be trouble between them, has still gone. In other words, he's exposing himself to further danger as well. And this isn't danger just to his own person, but to the dream, to their future. So Steinbeck gives us this self-destructive part of George just before he makes the decision to kill Lennie in the next chapter. It makes us realise that in George, the impulse to destroy is greater than the impulse to create. And he's not going to want to create this farm more than he wants to destroy that possibility of happiness. The question becomes, is this an insight into George's character, or is Steinbeck presenting it as an insight into the character of all men? Is the world the way it is because of our impulse to destroy things? In chapter 5, George decides he must kill Lennie, and the hat is a symbol of his attempt to hide his emotions from the others, in particular Slim. We get to understand George through Lennie's eyes here. He's just killed his puppy. Now maybe George ain't gonna let me tend no rabbits. He's obsessed with George again. He'll say, now just for that, you don't get to tend no rabbits. We get the sense that this future punishment here is something that George has used many times before to control Lennie. Again, Lennie is completely obsessed with what George is going to do. Now I won't get to tend the rabbits, now he won't let me. And we can see what a controlling influence George has been. The problem seems to be that George has been trying to control Lennie through threats. And this has proved a really unproductive parenting style, if you like, because he's done nothing to help Lennie control his strength. We've seen how essential this is in the fight with Curly and the amount of destruction that Lennie has done simply with one hand. And Steinbeck might be suggesting that part of the problem is the way that men are perceived in this society. They're supposed to be strong and they're supposed to be violent, which is why George hasn't corrected those habits in Lennie. Lennie hasn't learnt what strength is and therefore what gentleness is. And this is echoed in the kind of language that George uses with Lennie, and that Lennie echoes back here. Goddamn little son of a bitch, he calls the puppy. And there's even a hint of Steinbeck having a joke here, because Lennie thinks he's using an expletive, but actually he's using an exact description. This puppy is literally a son of a bitch. It's as though Steinbeck is poking fun at the masculine posturing that George has encouraged. Curly's wife realises that George's parenting style is all about dictatorship. George giving you orders about everything is a bit like being in the army. But what Lennie just remembers is that I can't tend no rabbits if I talk to you or anything. So unwittingly here, George has created a crisis. If Lennie talks to Curly's wife, ironically it's going to be Lennie's fear of George that causes him to kill Curly's wife. George sees me talking to you, he'll give me hell. And there's a double irony here in that George is going to kill Lennie, and certainly in a Christian tradition, Lennie will go to hell as a murderer. When he kills Curly's wife, he's not really even thinking about her. It's George that's obsessing him, as we can see with the repetition of his name. Oh, please don't do that, George will be mad. And it's George's method of parenting, his punishment of Lennie, that ironically leads to Curly's wife's death. And then perhaps Steinbeck is being deliberately ironic when he gets George to say this. You're going to get me in trouble just like George says you will. And it's George's prohibitions on Lennie that have led to this inevitable tragedy. It's not her fault, it's George's. If he had said nothing, Lennie would not be concerned about the noise and would probably have just let go. Of course, you don't have to take that interpretation. You can assume that Lennie would have panicked anyway and that her death was inevitable. This is caused by an indifferent fate rather than George's personality. However, George's role in this, I think, is emphasised by the fact that Lennie keeps returning to it. George will be mad if you yell. George will be mad. These are the things that drive him to kill. George's madness and Lennie's fear of disappointing him. And now a further interpretation of George's action arises. He's gonna be mad, says Lennie again, in the brush till he come. And we've seen George prepare the ground for this moment by telling Lennie to hide in the brush. In fact, we get the sense that this is something new, not something that's necessarily happened before. It's as though George has been preparing for this very moment, and he's left him unsupervised. Now remember, the night before, he left Lennie unsupervised and then found him in Crooks's room and disapproved. Now he's left him unsupervised again. It's as though George is giving Lennie as many opportunities as possible to do something bad. Now, I'm not suggesting that he intends for Lennie to kill anyone, but he does intend for Lennie to do something that's going to be serious enough for them to get sacked. Because this seems to be the only way that he can get rid of Lennie, by building up enough anger to finally leave him. George's behaviour once he finds Curly's dead wife is very revealing. To begin with, he appeals to Jesus Christ. On the one hand, this is simply used as an expletive or an exclamation, but if we take the Christian reading of the play, it's also a prayer, and it's a prayer perhaps for her soul and for Lennie's, because he knows that Lennie has killed her, but perhaps also a prayer for himself, because he knows very quickly what he's going to do to Lennie. Next, he has no more animosity towards Curly's wife, nor does he see her now as a sex object. His hand is pretty much on her breast, if not cupping it, to hold her heart, but he has absolutely no interest in her as a sex object now. He's just linking with her heart. There is a kind of personal connection here by focusing on the heart. He could easily have felt for her pulse in her neck or in her wrist, but Steinbeck wants him to make this personal connection. Then we have this description of his manner. His face was as hard and tight as wood, and his eyes were hard. And we immediately realise here that he has come to the decision to kill Lennie. And he's not going to kill Lennie because Curly is going to kill him. He's going to kill Lennie because Lennie has become a murderer. And he knows that there is no other way out. He could, of course, decide to hand Lennie over to the police, but the consequences of that will be incarceration in a lunatic asylum where he'll probably be tied down with straps and caged, just as Slim suggests later. However, there is another more sinister side to George here. When Candy asks him who's done it, he replies coldly, "And ain't you got any idea?" Now, Candy's only just met Lennie, and why should he assume that Lennie has committed this murder? After all, he has no sexual interest in Curly's wife. It's much more likely to be somebody who's attempted to rape her. So the only reason that George can ask this is because it has been so obvious to him for so long that he automatically expects other people to realise that Lennie is this dangerous. And this again leads me, although it doesn't have to lead you, but it leads me to suppose that he's deliberately leaving Lennie unsupervised because he's expecting some kind of tragedy to occur, and this will be his final escape from Lennie. Steinbeck then spells this out, I think, a little more strongly. "I should have knew," George said hopelessly. "I guess, maybe way back in my head, I did." You've got two options here. You can see this as a confession that George never really believed in the hope of the ranch, and he's suddenly realising that it was ultimately hopeless. But another possibility is that George has been denying this knowledge for a long time, even to himself. In fact, he already knew this, and his plan to get Lennie to hide in the brush simply reveals how inevitable he knew that tragedy was going to be. The question we have to ask ourselves is, did he know because he understands Lennie's nature is dangerous, or did he also know because he was going to create the conditions in which Lennie would become dangerous, because he keeps leaving Lennie unsupervised? He thinks momentarily of releasing Lennie, and then notices why the poor bastard had starved, and this seems more for Candy's benefit. He tried to reassure himself, because he knows, and we know that he knows, that Lennie is destined to be killed. As he starts to plan the murder of Lennie, he stops even listening to Candy, and Steinbeck has him here watching Candy's lips as he's preoccupied with how to murder Lennie, perhaps in the most humane way possible. I've talked before about how self-destructive George is and how he's almost bent on destroying their dream of the ranch. And here it is, he's admitting it to himself. "I think I knowed we'd never do her." But again, there's some self-deception here. He's suggesting that there is some outside force that's preventing it, but actually it's just himself. He and Candy could still raise the money together if they chose. But without friendship, there seems no point. In Chapter 6, we'll see how George seems to replace Lennie with Slim and re-establish a friendship. Strangely, it seems more attractive to George to become an aimless migrant worker again. "I'll work my month and I'll take my $50 and I'll stay all night in some lousy cat house." Which is deeply surprising when contrasted with the freedoms of owning their own ranch. Moreover, Candy probably isn't going to live long, and he's already pledged that in his will he'll hand it all over, he'll hand the farm over to George and Lennie, in this case to George. It still remains, therefore, a fantastic opportunity, but he simply throws it away. George then takes the decision out loud to kill Lennie. "There ain't no way out of that decision. I ain't going to let 'em hurt Lennie." And so this casts his killing of Lennie as a kind of a way of saving him. And that is the conventional view that you'll see in the study guides. But of course there's also an element of self-interest in ridding himself of Lennie. When Slim comes in to inspect Curly's wife's body, George is overcome with emotion. He nodded slowly, not replying. His hat was so far down on his forehead that his eyes were covered, and perhaps he's tearful, but certainly is hiding his emotion with the brim of his hat. And again George nodded, refusing to speak. And most readers use this to show how much George feels for Lennie, perhaps even loves him, and regrets the decision that he has made, but must follow it through in Lennie's best interests. It is the only way, as George has said. Slim articulates the very thoughts that George has been having. And suppose they lock him up and strap him down and put him in a cage. That ain't no good, George. Here, Slim is articulating what the most likely scenario is if Lennie even survives. So again, George is doing Lennie a favour by saving him from this tortured future and fate. But it is at this point that Steinbeck intervenes with symbolism. The gun that George is going to use is Carlson's Luger, and the Luger is symbolic of Nazism. The Nazis used the Luger. It was the gun of the German army. In 1937, when the book is published, the anti-Semitic rise of the Nazis in Germany is viewed with horror in America, even before the Second World War. By making George steal the Luger, Steinbeck is asking us to question his moral purpose. How much is it to save Lennie from the fate that we've just discussed, and how much of it is in his own self-interest? This is a problem that was faced by the director of the recent film, and you'll notice that he discarded a Luger because of the dangerous symbolism that would occur when George shoots Lennie with a Nazi's gun. But Steinbeck's novel is much richer and more complex than the film, and when you get to chapter 6, you have to decide what that balance of self-interest and self-sacrifice really is. Chapter 6 returns to the imagery, the motif if you like, of the heron eating the water snake that we had earlier in the book. And symbolically, the water snake might represent evil or the satanic, picking up the theme from the Garden of Eden. Or it might represent the dangers inherent in nature. Nature is inherently violent, and men are simply animals, just like mice are. We are all controlled by our animalistic desires. Here the heron kills the water snake, and Steinbeck uses this to foreshadow the way that George kills Lennie. If we take this symbolism a little further, then Lennie is symbolic of evil because he's actually committed a murder. And then this asks us to think about George's action. By killing Lennie, is he also a murderer? Well, in Christian terms he is, and so if we take a charitable view of George, we see him sacrificing his chance of heaven because his soul will be condemned to hell as a result of killing his best friend. Therefore he sacrifices himself to give Lennie greater happiness. He gives Lennie that view of heaven, that view of the little farm before he shoots him. But of course this symbolism, at least for George, breaks down if he doesn't believe in God. In that instance he'll be acting possibly out of self-interest. So Steinbeck toys with this idea and he portrays George in a really good light. Mind George because he's such a nice fella, says Aunt Clara in Lennie's voice. Lennie's imagining Aunt Clara. He been doing nice things for you all the time. So this characterises the act that is going to follow, George's killing of Lennie, as a good act. He's doing it with moral purpose. But another reading, of course, is deeply ironic. George is about to do something appalling and terrible, and George is only doing nice things in Lennie's head. This is Lennie's incredibly childish view of George's behaviour. He's forgotten all the times that George has beat him. In fact, Lennie at some point in the novel claims that George would never hurt him, and George himself has told Slim that that's simply not true. Lennie, of course, repeats the language that George must have been using with him all the time, and you'll stew the bejesus out of George all the time. Again, this is deeply ironic. If Jesus is stewed out of George, he becomes evil. In other words, he's blaming Lennie for making him, George, become evil. This is the same impulse that led George to blame Curly's wife for making an awful mess. And as we've seen in chapter 5, George himself has created that mess by prohibiting Lennie from speaking to her, and therefore giving him a motive for trying to shut her up. When Lennie imagines a giant rabbit speaking to him, the rabbit speaks with George's vocabulary, and it becomes much more violent. "You ain't worth a greased jackpin to ram you into hell." The urgency of this metaphor is deeply ironic, because George is going to be the jackpin that rams Lennie into hell. He's going to shoot him. And this must be the kind of language that George has used with Lennie, this undermining of his worth. And so a close reading of this text now makes us question again exactly why George kills Lennie, and we're much less likely to see it as altruism done simply for Lennie's good. Steinbeck now begins to revel in irony in the description of George. So Lennie says, "Ain't you going to give me hell?" meaning, aren't you going to have a real go at me? But George asks us to think of this in a different way. Give you hell? Because that's exactly what he's going to do. He's going to kill Lennie, and Lennie's soul, if it's the Christian universe we're talking about, will indeed go to hell because he's a murderer. Again, Steinbeck is deeply ironic. So George agrees to tell Lennie off, and he does it woodenly, as though he doesn't mean it. He does it without emotion, monotonously. But another way of interpreting this is he refuses to give it emotion because these are his real desires, and he doesn't want to reveal them even to himself. I could get a job and not have no mess. And that's exactly what's going to happen when he kills Lennie. This becomes an incredibly poignant moment in the novel, where George tries to get Lennie to see this vision of the farm, and it becomes symbolic of a vision of heaven. He's trying to save Lennie at the same time that he kills him. And so the little place symbolises heaven, both to Steinbeck and perhaps to Lennie. Steinbeck reminds us once again that the gun is in fact a Luger, and I talked about the symbolism of that in my video to chapter 5, and he picks up the sinister behaviour here where George has it behind Lennie's back. There's something deceitful about this, which again makes us question his motives. And then he stops looking at Lennie as a person. He looks at the place where the spine and the skull were joined. There is a terrible efficiency here as he decides to shoot through the brainstem. Of course, we can take the alternative interpretation and see that he is giving Lennie the most painless death that he possibly can. This is why he's behind Lennie's back. He doesn't want Lennie to have any sense of fear. He wants him to die ultimately happy with his dream of heaven. And this is also emphasised by his action with the gun. He raised the gun and his hand shook, and he dropped his hand to the ground again, as though overcome with the enormity of what he's going to do, and overcome with regret. Once more, George gets Lennie to picture this vision of heaven, like you can almost see the place. Steinbeck might be using this to suggest that there is no heaven, and to do that, we would have to focus on the word almost. Heaven seems real, but actually it's just a fantasy. Alternatively, it's only a fantasy because of the sin that Lennie has committed. Heaven is still there, he just can't reach it. Just before he shoots Lennie, he really describes his own behaviour. Nobody going to hurt nobody, nor steal from him. George has hurt Lennie and is the one who has taken his mouse from him. From Lennie's perspective, George is the person who has stolen from him. Next he says, I never been mad and I ain't now. And that's quite interesting to us because in chapter 1 he certainly sounded very mad. He was incredibly angry with Lennie. And he isn't now. He's not shooting out of anger. He's doing it in one reading out of love for his friend, and in another reading out of self-interest for himself. Steinbeck makes George wait until the moment that Lennie mentions the place, the farm, the vision of heaven. And when Lennie asks for it, he begs for his own death. Again, this is incredibly ironic. Let's do it now, he means get the farm, and right now, I got her, we got her, it's the murder itself. Killing Lennie certainly seems to cost George. The hand shook. Not his hand, it's as though it belongs to somebody else, and it shook violently because it's about to commit an incredibly violent act. And then his face set and his hand steadied, as though he has to control all his emotions. We understand that George is forced into this position because he hears the sound of the men coming, and the alternative is to let Curly kill Lennie painfully. Steinbeck now uses the killing symbolically, so George threw the gun away from him near the pile of old ashes. This is a symbol of death, and these ashes are old. Death is a recurring thing in this society, and perhaps Steinbeck is suggesting that causing death is simply part of the human condition. That's just what men have done throughout history, and hence the ashes are old. I've talked before about George's capacity for self-deception, and here he looks at his right hand. It becomes disembodied, as though it's the hand itself that's killed Lennie, and not he himself. He's trying to distance himself from culpability, from having taken the decision to murder his friend. To Slim, murder seems entirely acceptable. He doesn't even see it as that unusual. A guy got to sometimes. This is the way men must behave. Murder is part of their DNA, he seems to be suggesting, and that's a good thing. It's part of what makes you a man, a guy. Again, George tries to distance himself from what he's done. He looks steadily at his right hand that had held the gun, as though the hand itself is responsible. However, it's no longer called the hand, it's now his hand. And Steinbeck is probably suggesting here that George is facing up to his own actions. Slim readmits George into a masculine world, and so in the typical masculine behaviour he offers a drink and then George accepts. This is a recurring motif in American literature and indeed in film. You will always see the hero turn to the bar and turn to drink at moments of emotional crisis. But of course Steinbeck could be criticising this. He could be saying this kind of male behaviour is part of what's wrong with men. And one interpretation of the ending here is to view it with a degree of happiness. Slim at least understands the emotional turmoil that George is facing, and he ends George's feeling of loneliness. He offers him companionship and takes a lead here. Come on, George. George, let himself be helped. Come on with me. And there is an optimistic ending in the symbolism of the end as well, up towards the highway. Highway itself is suggestive of a better way, a higher moral purpose, perhaps even heaven itself. So the ending here can suggest that George is achieving something with Slim that he couldn't get with Lennie. But you could take a more cynical view and see that George has partly stage managed this. He has killed Lennie precisely so that he can be free to form new relationships. Steinbeck refuses to tell us, and it's as though he's saying we are all capable of goodness and evil, but that no act is ever wholly good. Everything is a compromise with our desires. Steinbeck is keen, however, to show George as different from the other men. Even if he has been acting partly for self-interest, he has also been acting for Lennie's interests, and he sacrificed his own happiness, or if you take the Christian view, his own soul, in order to help save Lennie. Whereas we might see George as achieving some kind of happy ending through this phrase here, Steinbeck refuses to end the book there. Indeed, it would be a natural end, wouldn't it? But instead he has this kind of rider, or a coda or warning. And it's the reaction of Curly and Carlson, who represent the typical men of the time. Now, what the hell you suppose is eating them two guys? So they cannot understand what George must be feeling. As far as they're concerned, he's done what he should have done. He's killed a murderer and should feel absolutely no guilt or emotion about it. And it is this lack of fellow feeling which is the tragedy of the novel. Because men do not empathise with each other, they turn to violence. And this is why fate always seems to conspire against them, and the best laid plans gang off to gley. But there is hope. If we follow Slim and George, we can see that there is in fact a better way, and perhaps mankind is worth saving. Just as Slim tries to save George, and George commits murder to save Lennie.